Watch everybody. This is a video on digital asset custody. As I see it, it's something that I've been researching for the last year in anger, and something that I've been aware of for quite a long time. Obviously, recent events in the market with what's been happening with CeFi custodians of digital assets, the problems that we've seen with Celsius, Terra Luna, Three Arrows, FTX, all of these things now, it seems like Genesis as well. All of these things seem to be interrelated, but this has definitely raised the awareness around self-custody versus custodial solutions. And what I think people are not as much aware of are non-custodial solutions that are appearing on the market. So what I wanted to do is just give you an idea of the way I think of this stuff, because I think this is useful to think of sovereignty as a spectrum, and the kind of personas that we are dealing with right now in the crypto asset sector, and how they would perceive custody and utility. Because I think right now these two things are probably on different ends of the spectrum. So what I've got in this diagram that you can see here is sovereignty at the top, with maximum sovereignty on this left hand side here, and personas I would associate with maximum sovereignty. I would call them the sovereign individual. And then right on the other extreme end is the consumer, who really doesn't know or care about sovereignty in the way that we in the crypto asset sector view it. And then in the middle is the informed citizen. We can elaborate on that later. Now, I've got on bottom here, and it could be controversial, but utility going in the other direction. So typically, and this has at least been true for the last kind of 5 to 10 years, at least the first 5 years, maybe the last 5 years, not so much. But typically, the more utility is available in a wallet, the more custodial it becomes. And we can go into the reasons for that. But that's the way I see it. So if I can frame it with sovereignty going from left to right and utility as well, kind of maximizing on the right-hand side rather than the left-hand side here. So let's start with self-custodial wallets, because this is what everyone right now is beating the drum on. And if you had your assets in self-custody throughout all of 2022, you'd have arguably avoided the problems that we saw with FTX, Celsius, and the rest of the CeFi asset holders who essentially just defrauded their customers. That was through a combination of commingling assets and good old-fashioned misreporting of assets and stealing, just basic theft. Nothing clever, nothing crypto-related. It was just good old-fashioned TradFi theft. But it was made possible because they had full control of digital assets. So when we look at self-custody, what does that actually mean? Well, it's you require a key to transfer your assets on the blockchain. And the holder, if you're the holder of your own keys in the first person, that's referred to as self-custody. You're your own bank, your own butcher and baker. You're fully responsible for holding those digital assets and protecting that key, which allows the transfer of assets to a third party. Now, there are let's start with two different types of self-custodial wallets, hardware and software, and these get divided into smaller categories as well. Let's start with arguably the most sovereign form of self-custodial wallet, and that's a brain wallet. So what does that mean? You are remembering a 12-word or a 24-word, if you're really brainy, mnemonic phrase, which is a representation of a random number, which is your private key. If you haven't told anyone else that you have memorized this private key, then the mnemonics, then essentially it dies with you. So, and no one really knows that you have it. Now, if people know that you're a proponent of brain wallets and you've memorized your 12-word seed phrase, they can coerce you into handing that over, either by threatening you or your family with violence. Simple way of doing it. The $5 wrench attack is what that's normally known as. So the fact that you've memorized this on its own isn't necessarily enough to make it unconfiscatable. If I know that you've memorized your 12-word mnemonic phrase and you have family, I can coerce you, I think, into either handing over your assets or killing you in the process. Then what's the next phrase up? Also, if something happens to you, like you, I don't know, forget those 12 words or the order in which they're required to be remembered in, because the order is important, then you lose the private key as well. So, but that is arguably the most sovereign form of holding your assets. No one else knows about it if you didn't tell them, and it's locked in your head. The next step up would be to write those 12 words down, the mnemonic phrase down, and now you have the problem of how do you secure this, and there are tried and tested ways of doing this, and there are your own way of doing this, which is doomed to failure. If you don't abide by a kind of recognized scheme for managing your mnemonic phrase as it's written down on paper, and there is some out there, there's some recognized ways of doing this, you're really opening up yourself to losing that piece of paper or pieces of paper, or having someone compromise get access to that mnemonic phrase and steal your assets. By the way, the word stealing is a little bit of an odd word to use here. On the blockchain, whoever knows the mnemonic phrase is the owner by default, de facto. De facto owner is whoever knows what the key is. So theft is an odd word to use sometimes, but that's a different discussion. So also these paper wallets, as they're called, are easily burnable. They can be destroyed quite easily. They can be stolen and the rest of it. So we have some alternatives, which I quite like, which are the metal wallets. Essentially makes it a more robust form of storing the mnemonic phrase, but it doesn't make it any easier. Like, there's still the burden of how many of these metal wallets you have. Where do you store them? Where do you put them? Are they in safe houses? Like, how you manage that? None of that goes away. It just makes it a far more robust form of storing your mnemonic phrase and storing your keys. And then finally, arguably kind of the best form of storing a seed phrase is on an electronic hardware device like a Ledger Nano or a Trezor. And here you get into, this is what is being advocated really right now by most people who say self-custody is important, who believe self-custody to be important, which I do, by the way. These devices can be very helpful because as long as they're not connected to the internet all the time, and we're going to another segregation between what is a hot wallet versus a cold storage. We'll go into that in a moment. But these devices are pretty helpful because they're very secure. If they're built on open source code and open source hardware, and you have the ability to actually understand what that means, you can go in and audit them yourselves. But otherwise, there is some element of trust in people who have looked at these, who say that the source is fine. They're not doing anything stupid or kind of compromising the storage of your private key. Other people tend to do this. There's only very few people, I think, who can read the code or understand the hardware, but at least the option's there. And if you really wanted to make sure that the device that you're using is secure and isn't going to compromise your keys, then you can do that to a large extent with these wallets. Now, I should mention that with Ledger Nano, I believe some of the BIOS code is proprietary, so that won't be shown. It's not available. But Trezor, I think, is entirely open source. So good luck. If you really want to be a sovereign individual, then these are some of your options on the hardware side. On the software side, you can store your private key and have a wallet as a software wallet on a native PC. Could be a browser extension, could also be a progressive web application, or it could be a native mobile app. These are just some of the examples of software wallets. Now, it should be said that software wallets tend to be also, these are hot wallets because they're more or less constantly connected to the internet. Obviously, you could just disconnect your PC, you could turn you could have a software wallet on a native mobile application and disable wireless access and Bluetooth, and de facto make it a hardware wallet. Sorry, a cold storage wallet. The reason why cold storage is considered to be safer than like hot storage is because it's not connected to the internet. And I think just yesterday, unfortunately, one of the core Bitcoin developers claims to have lost 200 Bitcoin through a hot wallet that was stored on his PC, and the keys were compromised. He was encrypting them using PGP. We won't get into it, but essentially, if the device in which you're storing your private key is connected to the internet, there's an increased risk of hackers obtaining access to it. So just be aware of that. This is why cold storage is often deployed by institutional investors. And if your Ledger Nano or your Trezor isn't connected to your PC and has Bluetooth turned off, it's cold storage, which is the safest thing from a security perspective. Let's jump to the other side of this, which is custodial wallets. And I think, this is where I term them as just consumers who don't care or don't know about the security aspect or sovereignty aspect of holding your assets, and they're far more concerned with utility. Custodial wallets have traditionally been far easier to use. You can gain exposure to a vast variety of crypto assets very quickly. Maybe requires a KYC process, some kind of onboarding, but then you're away. And it's down to the custodian. You have now, as the first person, you've given the third person your private key, and they are the custodian of your digital assets. Now, they're essentially promising you that they're not going to steal those assets. And under various regulatory regimes, depending on where you are in the world, that can be secure. It may not be secure. It's down to the individual to decide exactly how secure that is. But they definitely offer utility, and you've got to remember, until the advent of decentralized exchanges, everyone who's using exchanges like Coinbase or Binance is taking on some custodial risk when they transfer their assets to that exchange to sell them. That risk goes away with decentralized exchanges, but other risks come into play. But it's just worth noting that, even as a self-custodial holder of assets, you typically deploy your assets onto a centralized exchange to sell them. The longer you leave them there, the more exposed you are to the risk of the custodian going out of business or otherwise stealing your funds. So there are two types, I think, of custodial wallets. Some of them allow you to transfer into self-custody, and some of them don't. They force you to cash out before you can... they force you to cash out your Bitcoin. So if you wanted to transfer your Bitcoin, you have to sell it for dollars and then rebuy those Bitcoin on another exchange using your dollars or your pounds. Whereas some of these custodial wallets do allow assets to be transferred to self-custody. So you provide your Bitcoin address, wallet address, and after making a purchase, you can transfer into self-custody. Ultimately, though, I think there's a lot of utility provided, simplicity, better user experience, and utility provided by these custodial wallets as opposed to self-custodial wallets, with the gap arguably closing. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. Non-custodial wallets. Well, what is non-custody? It's when, and this changes depending on the region that you're in and the regulatory regime under which you're operating. But in the UK and the US, and I guess the EU as well, is typically when more than one party is required to sign a transaction online. And in order to do that, it means there are either multiple keys involved in signing a transaction, or a single key is split into multiple parts. So let's look at this. Multi-signature, tends to describe a situation where there are multiple private keys required to sign a transaction online. Let's say 3. And 2 of 3, or a threshold number of these keys, are required to sign the transaction. So what does that mean? One way I always imagine this is, for anyone who is around in the 80s when you thought nuclear apocalypse was around the corner, it would be really a case of like two people required to simultaneously turn a key on two devices separated by, let's say, 12 meters in order to launch a nuclear missile. You needed a minimum of two people. And if one of them decided not to do that, then the other one pull a gun out and threaten to kill them. Now, with a 2 of 3 threshold multi-signature regime, typically what happens is that the wallet provider holds a key. You hold the other 2 keys, but you hold them in different locations. One of them is on your mobile device, let's say, and the other one is somewhere else. And in the event of the wallet provider going out of business, you can still sign your transactions by getting hold of your second key. And as you have 2 of 3, you can sign that transaction online. So that's like a very crude description of multi-sig. Remember that you can have any number of keys, and you can set the threshold at whatever level you like. So again, non-custodial because no single entity on their own can sign transactions under ordinary operations. And then there's the alternative part of this. So multi-sig is very popular, I think, as a number of wallets implement this for end consumers. There is an alternative, which is multi-party computation, and that's taking a private key, one private key, but splitting it into multiple shards or multiple shares. And this is something that's employed by institutions rather than individuals at this stage, although there are some consumer wallets that deploy a shard or a share onto a customer device, and that comes with its own complexity. Because typically it's not a good idea, if you can avoid deploying cryptographic material onto an end user device, that's preferable to deploying it onto the device, because if that device gets lost or stolen, there's now cryptographic material out there in the wild that someone could potentially use to sign transactions. Although, there's a lot of protection you can put in place on that device to stop that situation from happening. It's just bad practice by principle, and you may accept that principle or you may reject it. But certainly for institutions, this is really interesting way of doing custody, because what would normally happen is that these key shards aren't shared over the network. Instead, proofs of the fact that you hold them are shared. So no cryptographic material leaves the secure enclaves of the devices that are used to manage the custody of these key shards, which is quite a powerful security notion. And this has been used now for in production for several years by some very large digital asset custodian, institutional digital asset custodians. So I think it's quite a proven way of managing and securing signing of digital assets, or it's a proven non-custodial way of managing asset custody. And so I think I don't want to go on for too long in this particular video, but I just think it's important to understand the difference between self-custodial, custodial, and where the innovation is happening, I think, is in the non-custodial space. This is the space that I would watch, because there's some very interesting things happening that make user experience simpler without overly compromising sovereignty. Now, the reality, I think, for anyone is that all 3 forms of custody should be used in your wealth management regime. It's not a case of everything's in self-custody or everything's custodial. No, you're going to need all 3 depending on the amount of assets that you have, and you should look very carefully at the quantity of assets that you place in each form of custody, but you should use all 3. Thanks for listening. I hope that was helpful, and speak to you soon.